Hi, I'm Brendan Rivers.
I'm Tammy Cherry.
And you're listening to Bygone Jacks, our unsung history from WJCT Public Media.
This is the second half of our story of the 1863 Civil War occupation of Jacksonville by two of the first black regiments in the Union Army. If you haven't heard the first episode, I highly recommend you go back and listen to it before continuing with this episode.
And just a quick warning before we get started, this story touches on sensitive topics like race and slavery. For historical context, we'll be sharing quotes from primary sources that may contain racist or derogatory language. There are also some graphic descriptions of violence. Part 4. River Raids. On the morning of March 25, 1863, the same day that Colonel Thomas Higginson had marched west out of Jacksonville with the first racially integrated force in the U.S. Army to see action, a Union steamship set off upriver.
On board were Colonel James Montgomery and both companies of the all-black 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry Regiment, along with a few soldiers from the 1st South. Their goal? Head up the St. Johns River and penetrate inland Florida in hopes of seizing supplies and freeing enslaved people who might choose to join the regiment's ranks.
On their way up the river, Montgomery's men capture 46-year-old Thomas T. Russell, a farmer and state senator. Montgomery, who had a reputation for being pretty brutal to his enemies, sees this as a great opportunity to scare the Confederacy and its sympathizers.
Abolitionists before the war, Montgomery from Kansas had fought in Bleeding, Kansas. He's another one that had kind of made the decision that abolitionism shouldn't be a pacifist movement. This is something that should be fought.
That's Wesley Moody, a history professor at Florida State College at Jacksonville.
Montgomery speaks harshly to Russell, then lets him go. A few days later, Russell writes 2 reports about his encounter with Montgomery and his men, sending one to a Tallahassee newspaper and the other to General Finnegan himself.
Montgomery informed me that he had come up for the purpose of permanently occupying Palatka and that they intended restoring Florida to the Union at all hazards, that he would have a force of some 5,000 men at Palatka in a few days, that they had been acting in a mild way all along, but that they intended now to let us feel what war actually was, that all the Negroes were declared free and he intended to take all he could find.
Russell's report wasn't the first to appear in the Confederate press. Word of an invasion of Florida by black troops led by radical Yankee abolitionists was spreading quickly, seemingly confirming white Southerners' worst fears about the Union's goals.
On Friday the 27th, Montgomery and his men arrive in Palatka after raiding a series of plantations on their way up the river. Their objective is to rescue the wife and 2 children of Private John Quincy, a cook in the 1st South. But they have no idea that rebel forces led by Captain J.J. Dickinson, known as the Swamp Fox, are waiting.
In his after-action report, Dickinson recounts with satisfaction how he and his concealed troops waited for just the right moment to attack.
So soon as I saw 30 or 40 men on the wharf, and at the same time the upper and lower deck of the boat crowded as thick as they could stand, I ordered my men to fire, which order was executed in as cool and deliberate a manner and in as good order as any men could do. The enemy immediately retreated to their boat in great confusion, dragging their dead and wounded after them, and as falling back returned our fire both by small arms as well as heavy and light artillery, throwing shell, grape, and canister shot, moving as rapidly as their steam could carry them under cover of their heavy fire. My candid opinion is that we must have killed and wounded no less than from 20 to 30. Among the trophies on the wharf was a considerable quantity of blood in several places, and also many fragments of bone, pronounced by the surgeon of the post here pieces of cranium. Excuse my lengthy report, as I deem it my duty to give you all the details and real acts of such demons.
Dickinson overstates the number of casualties inflicted by his ambush, but 2 Union soldiers are injured in the attack. One of them is John Quincy, who would die of his wounds several weeks later without ever being reunited with his family.
Despite frustration in Palatka, overall the raiding party is seen as a success. Montgomery and his men bring back food, supplies, and a number of newly freed black people to Jacksonville.
Even as Montgomery's troops steam their way back down the river, Higginson is planning their next move.
Now that Jacksonville is safely held and under Colonel Rust's command, He can take Montgomery and some of their men back up the river, occupy Palatka or some other spot farther inland, then focus on swelling the ranks of the black Union regiments by raiding plantations to free the enslaved.
This will give his men another chance to act independently of the white troops. Higginson had been happy to see black and white soldiers serve side by side, but he thought the cause of black enlistment would be better served if the laurels his soldiers won were theirs alone.
But before this new plan can be set in motion, a dispatch arrives from Major General David Hunter, who was stationed at headquarters in Hilton Head.
Immediately on the reception of this communication, you will embark all the U.S. troops at Jacksonville without exception, including the colored regiments, and will return to the stations previously occupied at Beaufort, South Carolina. Of course, all the supplies that have been sent to Jacksonville will also be embarked. A complete withdrawal of all the forces from Jacksonville is intended and hereby ordered. The necessary transportation will be sent immediately. Promptitude is expected in this movement.
Part 5. Exodus. Higginson is shocked and sickened by Hunter's message.
The possession of this place gives the key to Florida, and the present garrison can hold it and spare us to go upriver, and yet we must go back. It is the first time I have been thoroughly subjected to that uncertainty of counsel, which has been the bane of the war. It has defeated us in this case, just in the hour of success.
That success doesn't just include what the black troops have managed to accomplish during their short time in Florida. The invasion of the South Atlantic mainland by black soldiers has grabbed the attention of both the South and the North.
Within a week of Higginson's troops landing at Jacksonville, reports of the mission had shown up in Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston papers. Each made it clear that the mission was being led by abolitionists and that the Union was taking aim at the institution of slavery itself. Knowing this must have left Higginson and his colleagues even more frustrated with the decision to leave Jacksonville.
Despite their own discontent with the new orders, the soldiers in Jacksonville start getting ready to leave immediately. But the process is a daunting one. They don't just have to move 2,600 officers and men. They also have to account for all of their equipment, ammunition, provisions, and any citizens who want to leave Jacksonville with them.
On the morning of March 29th, as the men are getting ready to leave Jacksonville, fires break out in the upper part of town. Guards are ordered to put the fires out and capture anyone responsible, but they're too late. Whoever started the fires is already gone.
A wind soon spreads the fires to nearby buildings. Almost all of them are made of southern pine, a timber full of highly flammable pitch. The resulting flames and fumes force the soldiers to act as firemen and policemen as they get ready to leave Jacksonville. Sergeant Charles Codwell writes about what he saw in his diary.
This wanton act of vandalism was charged upon the Negro Regiment, and they in turn said the 8th Maine Regiment was to blame. No doubt, both of these regiments had something to do with its destruction. It was entirely unnecessary and uncalled for, and the wanton act of burning a town would not destroy the rebellion, nor reflect any credit upon the soldiers of the Union who fired it. Justice should overtake all, and severe punishment meted out to those who so far forget the bounds of propriety as to disgrace the honored cause in which they are engaged.
By now, civilians, most of them having recently escaped from slavery, are crowding the docks, waiting their turn to board the Union ships. Some were enslaved in Jacksonville when the expedition arrived. A few had even liberated themselves and fled to Jacksonville, but most had been gathered up and freed by the black troops during the upriver raids.
None of the black men, women, and children are allowed to stay in Jacksonville, though some may have preferred that. All are to be taken to Fernandina or Port Royal, where they'll join those working for the Army or in agriculture. 11 black men decide to enlist in the 2nd South Carolina instead.
White residents are given an option: stay in Jacksonville or leave with the Union troops. 50 of the 300 or so remaining, all but 4 of them women or children, decide to leave. For many, desperation is the motivation. They're penniless and depend on military rations. Others are just afraid of retribution. They fraternize with the invaders and expect the worst if they're to come under Confederate rule again. Like the formerly enslaved, the white evacuees are taken to Fernandina or Port Royal. What they do after that is up to them.
As the troops depart Jacksonville, a correspondent from the New York Tribune is on board one of the Union ships. From where they stand, not one living thing can be seen on the streets of Jacksonville, except for one woman, a horse tied to a fence, and a dog.
The scene is one of most fearful magnificence. On every side, from every quarter of the city, dense clouds of black smoke and flame are bursting through the mansions and warehouses. A fine south wind is blowing immense blazing cinders right into the heart of the city. The beautiful Spanish moss, drooping so gracefully from the long avenues of splendid old oak trees, has caught fire. And as far as the eye can reach, through these once pleasant streets, nothing but sheets of flame can be seen, running up with the rapidity of lightning to the tops of the trees and then darting off to the smallest branches. Is this not war? Vindictive, unrelenting war.
Part 6. Black Enlistment. Why did General Hunter order the troops in Jacksonville to withdraw? For one, the unexpected strength of the Confederate military resistance in Florida. Plus, the general's planning to launch an invasion of Charleston, South Carolina, a major Confederate port, the symbolic heart of secession, and the city where the Southern Rebellion had started. Hunter's convinced he needs the regiments he sent to Jacksonville to take this rebel stronghold. He strips away some of the garrison forces at Fernandina and St. Augustine for the same reason.
General Hunter decides it would be pointless to leave the black regiments unsupported in Florida. If he had, the men probably would have been pinned down in Jacksonville, making it impossible to accomplish the mission's main objectives. They would have tied up some of the supply ships that were needed in South Carolina, too. It was even possible that they'd be overwhelmed by Finnegan's forces. So Hunter decides to bring the St. John's expedition to an abrupt end.
To the disappointment of Higginson, he is pulling everything he's got to throw at Charleston. And Charleston is a well-fortified city. And the famous fight, of course, is Battery Wagner. It's a sand fort south of the city. If you've seen of course, the movie Glory, that's the final battle scene there is Fort Wagner. And it doesn't go well. It is probably a vast understatement, and Charleston is never captured during the war.
Union forces try to take Charleston on April 7th, but their ships are forced to retreat less than 3 hours after the battle starts.
The failure in Charleston happens as the Northern public is still learning about the St. John's expedition. Press reports on the invasion of Florida by black troops bent on emancipating the enslaved had spread to the West after papers in the East broke the story in mid-March. Opinion remains divided along partisan lines.
Meanwhile, President Abraham Lincoln is thrilled with the reports he's reading about the black troops occupying Jacksonville. On April 1st, still unaware that General Hunter has recalled the expedition, the president sends him a personal note of congratulations.
I am glad to see the accounts of your colored force at Jacksonville. I see the enemy are driving at them fiercely, as is to be expected. It is important to the enemy that such a force shall not take shape and grow and thrive in the South. And in precisely the same proportion, it is important to us that it shall. Hence, the utmost caution and vigilance is necessary on our part. The enemy will make extra efforts to destroy them, and we should do the same to preserve and increase them.
News of the St. John's expedition's recall sparks a second wave of public reaction. General Hunter is heavily criticized by much of the Republican press for his decision to abruptly end a mission that was by all accounts succeeding. Here's the New York Evening Post.
If General Hunter had desired to do the state of Florida and the cause of freedom and union in the South the greatest injury, he could not have adopted a course more certain of success than the one he has adopted.
After the failure in Charleston, General Hunter again turns his attention to liberating the enslaved. But he's now under orders to keep troops ready to support the Navy in operations against Charleston.
In mid-April, Hunter had sent a whole brigade of infantry to help a Union commander on the North Carolina coast, so he doesn't have the troops to spare for even one mainland invasion.
But he continues to plan and lobby for these kinds of missions. In late May, he makes his case directly to President Lincoln.
Hunter's goal of sending more missions of liberation deep into rebeldom are never realized. In fact, President Lincoln relieves him of command on June 12th.
Hunter's successor, Brigadier General Quincy Gilmore, isn't as focused on emancipation. He does launch another St. Johns River expedition in February 1864 that successfully holds Jacksonville through the end of the war, but its goal is simply to seize cotton and other valuable resources for the U.S. government and to deprive the rebel armies of supplies.
We'll have more after the break.
Like what you hear? Well, there's plenty more where that came from here at WJCT Public Media in Jacksonville, Florida. So be sure to check out some of our other offerings, including First Coast Connect with Melissa Ross. That's me. The Florida Roundup. And What's Health Got to Do with It? On this or any other podcast platform. You can also find out about programming at WJCT.org and on our app. Tune in today.
Newspaper reports about what the black troops had accomplished during the third occupation of Jacksonville, along with the eyewitness accounts of the white troops that had been there, were widely read, heard about, and discussed in the Department of the South, which led to many of the white soldiers looking more favorably at their black brothers in arms.
Daniel Sawtell of the 8th Maine, who came under artillery fire with the 1st South Carolina during their excursion west, made this observation the day after his regiment returned to Port Royal from Jacksonville.
I have thought the Negroes would not make good soldiers, and so did most of the men in this regiment. But in the several skirmishes they have had with the rebels, they have won the praises of all. And the rebels are as afraid of them as they would be of so many tigers.
But the expedition's impact reaches far beyond the Department of the South. In the North, those who support black recruitment see it as proof that black men could serve effectively in the Union Army and should be given the chance to do so. The New York Tribune says as much in an article published on March 28th.
The truth is that the fitness of Negroes to be soldiers has long since, in this country and elsewhere, been amply demonstrated, and the success of Colonel Higginson's black troops is no surprise to any person tolerably well informed about the history of the race. If it were in any sense an experiment, the only thing to be tested was the obstinacy of our Saxon prejudice, which denied the possibility of success and did what it could to prevent it. But even Saxon prejudice must shortly yield to the logic of facts.
Before March of 1863, only one black regiment other than the 1st South Carolina had fought the rebels. And as far as we know, until the St. John's expedition, no black unit had taken part in a sustained combat operation against Confederate soldiers, captured and held an important town, taken enemy prisoners, or gone into action side by side with white troops.
But the expedition doesn't just energize supporters of black recruitment, it also converts some of the skeptics, including the moderate Republican editor of the Washington Evening Star. In an editorial dated March 24th, they confessed that they had thought black troops would do more harm than good to the Union cause. But the reports from Florida changed their mind.
So far, their first expedition into the interior has been a complete success, for they had, when last heard from, accomplished everything hoped for up to that time from them.
On that same day, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton calls Adjutant General of the Army Lorenzo Thomas to his office in Washington, D.C. Stanton tells him that the Union Army will be moving forward with the full-scale enlistment of black troops as soon as possible.
Thomas is ordered to oversee the process. At the time, there were only 8 black regiments on duty, and 3 or 4 others were being formed. Here's FSCJ history professor Wesley Moody again.
I think Lincoln was always on the forefront of this. And Lincoln had this vision with the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, these go hand in hand. And his staff, his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, his Secretary, they're on board but more cautious. So Lincoln is always trying to convince them, trying to bring them along, trying to, you need to be courageous and let's just do this. And they need to see results. They need to see a test. And, we need to show the world, we need to show the country that we're doing this out of strength, not out of weakness. We need the successful occupation of Jacksonville to prove how good these guys are before we start raising more troops.
Colonel Higginson himself gets indirect confirmation that the Florida expedition influenced the Lincoln administration's decision to move forward with black enlistment. In May, he sits down with a well-connected Army officer who recently spoke with the Secretary of the Treasury. Higginson later writes about that conversation in his journal.
Secretary Chase told him that the cabinet at Washington kept their whole action in regard to enlisting colored troops waiting to hear from us in Florida. And when the capture of Jacksonville was known, the whole question was regarded as settled, the policy avowed, and Adjutant General Thomas sent out on his mission. This is, I think, the best expression of the importance of our action that has yet occurred.
On March 26th, President Lincoln makes his position clear in a letter to Andrew Johnson, Tennessee's military governor.
The colored population is the great available, and yet unavailed of, force for restoring the Union. The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers upon the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once. And who doubts that we can present that sight if we but take hold in earnest?
From that day forward, the War Department goes full steam ahead with black enlistment. In May, Stanton creates a Bureau of Colored Troops to oversee the process. Recruiting agents are spread throughout the Union and the occupied parts of the Confederacy.
By late October of that year, more than 37,000 black men in 58 regiments are wearing Yankee blue. By the time the Civil War ends in 1865, nearly 180,000 black men are serving or had served. Some historians believe the Union Army may not have been able to beat back the rebellion without this influx of manpower.
What the men of the 1st and 2nd South Carolina accomplished in Florida was widely celebrated, but quickly overshadowed by the actions of other black soldiers in a number of bloody battles that got national attention. Still, if the third occupation of Jacksonville had played out differently, those other men may have never gotten the chance to prove themselves.
Higginson goes back to Jacksonville in 1878 and meets up with some of his old soldiers who had returned since the war.
There were some singular instances of prosperity among these men who had been under my command. I was told in Jacksonville that I should find Corporal McGill, the most populous man in Beaufort. When I got there, I found him the proprietor of a livery stable, populous with horses at any rate. He was worth $3,000 or $4,000 and was cordial and hospitable to the last degree. At parting, he drove me to the station with his best carriages and horses. I found Sergeant Hodges, a master carpenter at Jacksonville. Corporal Hicks was a preacher there, highly respected. And I heard of Corporal Sutton as a traveling minister further up the river.
According to Ennis Davis, who writes about Jacksonville history on the Jackson, the impact of what Nurse Susie King Taylor and the black men serving in the 1st and 2nd South Carolina did here over 150 years ago is still felt to this day. Taylor's a fascinating character in her own right. She was the only African-American woman to publish a memoir of her experiences during the Civil War, and she taught many of the black soldiers how to read and write. After the war, she even opened a private school for the children of freedmen.
What was really interesting to me about Susie King Taylor and the connection to Jacksonville that continues to live on today is if you continue to read her memoirs after the Civil War, she always kept in contact with a lot of the people that she taught to read and write. And many of those people were the original not just USCT troops, but also the original settlers of La Villa, which is the oldest urbanized Gullah Geechee community in the state of Florida. So her as this educational conduit has helped build a foundation in Jacksonville that has given birth to many of the civil rights leaders that we cherish today. Many of those leaders gave birth to children who were instrumental in the Harlem Renaissance. And that's another aspect of history that people don't realize was largely driven by a lot of people in this area who went north during the Great Migration. That legacy led to many of the individuals involved in the civil rights fights of the 1950s and 60s. And it even lives on today in my generation, as there are people who continue to fight for inclusion and equity and diversity within all aspects of society. So that little window of time has paid big dividends in the history of not only Jacksonville, but America in general.
The 1st and 2nd South Carolina served honorably in the Department of the South through the end of the Civil War and beyond. The 2nd South even returned to Jacksonville with other Union forces during the 4th occupation of the city. In 1864, the 1st South was renamed the 33rd United States Colored Infantry Regiment, but the men didn't stop calling it the 1st South. And they never forgot how in 1863 they sailed up the St. Johns to make war on the Confederacy and slavery itself.
This is Bygone Jacks from WJCT Public Media. Thanks for listening. I'm Tammy Cherry.
And I'm Brendan Rivers. A big thanks to Jennifer Gray and her colleagues at Florida State College at Jacksonville, whose research made this podcast possible.
If you're interested in learning more about the River City's past, check out FSCJ's History of Jacksonville course.
And if you'd like to learn more about the 3rd occupation of Jacksonville, take a look at the show notes, where you can find links to the sources we used and more.